Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh no, I ain't messing with you. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no, I'm not messing with you.
Hey you guys, kind of a long video today, but I'm going to help you out a lot. First, I'm going to discuss natural selection and how that works. It's really a unifying concept in biology that everybody should understand. Second, I'm going to give you instructions for your final project of the school year. Don't be overwhelmed by this. It's on Flipgrid again, but you're going to have more than a week to do this time. So don't be overwhelmed by it. And then finally at the end of the video, I'm going to show you an example Flipgrid that I made. That way you know kind of what I'm looking for in your video. So right here is the final lecture of the 2019-2020 school year, and we are going to cover one of the biggest ideas in biology. In fact, it's called one of the central unifying ideas of biology, and that is natural selection. But it's going to be really easy for you to understand natural selection if we compare it to artificial selection. So if you look at all the breeds of dogs that exist out there today, right? Some of them are tall, some are short, some are very big, some are small. Some have very short and stubby legs. Some have a stub of a tail. Some have long tails. Some even kind of look like cats. So you might wonder, how do we have all of these different breeds of dogs today? And the answer is something called artificial selection. Artificial selection is when a person picks and chooses which organism he out of a flock or out of a population he wants to pass on their traits to the next generation. So, for example, imagine that you have a dog farm and you have these poodles, and you decide you want to make miniature poodles. You want to make what are called teacup poodles. Well, how would you go about this? Well, you have several dogs, and of course those dogs are going to vary in how big they are. Some of them will be tall, some of them will be short. Well, if you want overall the population to become shorter over time, what you might do is you might pick out the smallest dogs out of that entire population and only breed them together, right? You can kind of ignore the big dogs, right? Let them do whatever they want, but make sure that these guys are reproducing together. And so when these guys reproduce together, the next generation we would expect, on average, would be smaller than the generation that came before it, right? Because what the farmer is doing, or what the person in charge of the group of dogs is doing, is they are controlling what genes get passed on to the next generation. So generation 2 is smaller than the first because we controlled the breeding. And then we take all of the smallest dogs from that population, breed them together, and then finally, some generations later, we have teacup poodles. We have poodles that are actually fairly small when compared to normal poodles, right? So over here, we can see that over generations, we are actually kind of making the population of dogs evolve to be smaller, but we're doing it by artificially selecting which traits get passed on to the next generation. So it's actually dog breeding and this process of artificial selection that explains why we have so many different dog breeds these days, right? Dogs have been bred in the past for different reasons. Some of them have been for herding different animals like sheep or goats. Some of them have been for hunting, like hound dogs. Some have been sporting dogs. Some have been working dogs. Things like that. But the thing is that all dogs that we have today came from some wolf ancestor, some wolf-like ancestor. And so over thousands of years and generation after generation of artificial selection, we've been able to create all these different dog breeds, where if you just look a few thousand years ago, there were no other dog breeds. There was just kind of one ancestor of dogs. So artificial selection is when a person decides what traits will be allowed to move on to the next generation. And so what they're doing is they're controlling who reproduces. And the thing to understand here is that these changes happen over time, but the changes happen to a population of dogs over time. In the last example, right, there's not a single dog here who we could say evolved into a teacup poodle, right? Like this dog did not all of a sudden get smaller and evolve into a teacup poodle. Instead, evolution is something which takes place in a population, just like this is a population of dogs, but it takes place in a population over time, over many generations. So that's artificial selection. Natural selection is really the same thing, but instead of a person deciding what traits or genes get passed on to the next generation, nature or the environment is the thing that picks the traits. Now, I say here that natural selection is nature or the environment picks what traits or genes are best suited for survival, right? So the reason why I put genes is because, remember, your genes are kind of ultimately what give you your traits. So natural selection can select for a trait, but at the same time, it's also selecting for and favoring a gene that gives you that trait. So the thing is that those that survive in whatever environment they are in are able to reproduce. And when they reproduce, they pass on those traits to future generations. So take, for example, here, these giraffes. All right. So giraffes might have varying degrees of neck length, right? Just how some people are born tall or short, some giraffes are born with short necks or long necks. Well, why do giraffes have such long necks today? And the answer to that is natural selection, because the food that giraffes eat are on the leaves of trees that are high up in the air. And so if a giraffe happened to be born with a longer neck than everyone else, it would have a competitive advantage, right, over the other giraffes, because it would have a competitive advantage because it would be able to eat leaves that are higher up that his brothers and sisters and friends and stuff don't have access to. So if we had to pick which of these three is most likely to survive and pass on their genes to the next generation, we would have to pick this one. And notice here that it's not a person who is selecting for a longer neck. Instead, what's happening is that it's simply just a fact that the giraffes eat leaves from a tree. And so it's kind of the environment, it's the trees, it's the nature itself which is selecting long-necked giraffes to be passed on to the next generation. Now, before we get much further into this natural selection thing, I do understand that, being in Kansas and just being in the time that we live in, a lot of people are skeptical about evolution. But I'll tell you this, I don't want to raise your defenses no matter what you've been raised to believe. Because natural selection here, what I'm going to talk about with this video, natural selection, really everybody agrees that natural selection exists, right? You can doubt other parts of evolution, but this idea of natural selection, that nature kind of picks what traits get passed on to the next generation, that's not controversial. So even if you're someone who, believes that the Earth is 5,000 years old and all those sorts of things, if you doubt evolution, everybody who doubts evolution, right, still believes that natural selection exists. So you really don't have to be hostile to these ideas that I am showing you here today. But the idea here is that changes in populations add up over time, right? Over time, we would expect the population of giraffes for their necks to get longer over time. But it's the population here that is evolving, right? It's not like a giraffe is growing his neck just as we speak in order to reach up and get more leaves. Instead, it's the group of organisms. It's the population of organisms over time, which is the thing that evolves. So here's another example, right? Let's say that we're in a cold environment like Canada. And let's say that we have two different types of rabbits. We have rabbits with thick fur and we have rabbits with thin fur, and we have equal amounts of both. So in our initial population here, we have three or equal amounts of thick-furred rabbits and thin-furred rabbits. Well, now that you know what natural selection is and how it operates, you can probably make a prediction here. If we give this population of rabbits time in the cold Canadian winters, which rabbits do you think there will be more of several generations from now? You can go ahead and make a prediction, right? And so most of you might think, well, having a thick fur coat might be a good thing for someone who lives in a cold environment, right? These rabbits here might have a competitive advantage because they're able to stay warm and survive longer, and if they survive longer, then they're able to reproduce more. And so what we're going to see here is that these thin-furred rabbits are going to struggle to survive. So maybe that one dies and that one dies early, but these other guys are able to survive. And so what we would probably see in the next generation after these rabbits reproduce, what we would expect to see in the next generation is that there would be more or a higher percentage of thick-furred rabbits and a smaller percentage of thin-furred rabbits. So I want to kind of get something straight with the language here, right? In this case, we can say that natural selection favored thick fur in this particular environment. Now, we can easily imagine some environment where thick fur would not be favored by natural selection, right? Like, think of rabbits that live in hot areas, like down in Mexico, right? Natural selection probably would not favor thick fur, right? Because it's not advantageous to have thick fur in a hot climate. But it is advantageous in a place like Canada where it's cold. So here we can say that natural selection favored a certain trait in this environment over and above thin fur. Here's another example. So this is actually me playing a game. This is a game you can find online. And so I'm a wolf, I'm a predator, and there's two types of prey that I can eat. One of the prey are gray, and some of the prey are actually a tan color. But you'll notice here that this tan-colored prey just happens to perfectly blend in with the background, with the environment. And so you'll see that at the beginning of this thing, right, there was mostly, there's 36% gray prey. But by the end, that number had dwindled to 5%, right? Because here, natural selection is favoring a fur color of the prey that matches the background, that is camouflaged, right? And so what you'll see a lot of the times with these natural selection type things is things with camouflage, right? Why is it that, these gray furry guys struggle to survive so much? Well, it's not because of anything that they've done, really. It's just that because they happen to not blend in with their environment and they are easy pickings for this wolf. Here's another example of natural selection. This is actually a simulation. You can find the video for this online on YouTube, but what this guy did is he actually invented this organism called blobs. And what the blobs do is they live on the edge of this environment, and what they do is they venture out into the world and try to eat food and then get back to the edge. Now, if they eat food and get back to the edge, they survive. If they eat two foods and get back to the edge, they survive and also reproduce. And then if they fail to get food or get back to the edge, then they die. All right, now these organisms have one trait, and that is speed. All right, so they can go fast or they can go slow. Right now, they're going to start off with all of them going the same speed, at a speed of 1.0. Now, what's going to happen here is that when an organism reproduces here, it can mutate. And so that means it can either become faster or slower. So we're going to get to see here how this population will evolve. What's natural selection going to favor? Is natural selection going to favor slower organisms, or is natural selection going to favor faster organisms? So take a look at this this part right here. All right. Did you see what happened there? So we let this play out over several generations. What you see here at first is that everybody is the same speed. But as organisms are able to reproduce, some of their offspring are a little bit faster, some of them are a little bit slower. And so you can watch this play out over time. And over time, you begin to notice that, hey, the population as a whole is becoming faster. So because natural selection favored speed, the entire population is now faster than they were to begin with. Notice something here, that this population, not even the slowest person, even the slowest person in this population is still faster than where they started out. And so we can say here that this population of organisms evolved, that natural selection favored a faster speed because someone with a faster speed could get more food. Let's talk about one real-life example of natural selection. So in the 1800s in England, there was a type of moth. These are called peppered moths. And peppered moths come in two colorations. They can either be black or they can be white. Now, the white-colored moths, they happen to blend in with a certain tree that is populous in England, all right? And this tree has white fur, all right? So they blend in with the white fur. The black moths do not blend in with this tree, and so they're easy to get picked off by predators. Now, here's the thing, is that in the early 1800s, most of the peppered moths that existed were white, which makes sense because they could blend in with the tree. Now, the issue is that when the Industrial Revolution started, these big factories popped up, and factories, you know how they work. They have, smoke and soot and everything that actually comes out of their smokestacks. Well, what happened was that the smoke came out of the smokestacks, and it actually ended up settling on the trees, on the white trees. And those white trees actually became black. And they stayed that way for a little while, all right, because the soot and everything was just stuck to the tree. So this happened for several years, all right? So what we see is that over time, the number of white peppered moths decreases sharply. But at the same time, the number of black peppered moths goes up. Now, why did the amount of black peppered moths go up? The answer is because now, since the trees were all covered with soot, they were actually able to blend in with their environment. And so natural selection stopped favoring the white coloration, and it actually started favoring the black coloration. Now, here's the thing, is that factories today are not nearly as they don't pollute things as much as these Industrial Revolution factories did. So eventually, humanity figured out a way to make their factories so that they didn't stain the trees dark, right? So what do you think happened after cleaner forms of energy were developed for the factories? What do you think would happen? Make a prediction. If the trees were to be cleaned and were to be made white again, what would happen to the population of white moths, and what would happen to the population of black moths? You see here that natural selection allows you to make a prediction about what will happen in the future, right? So, what do you think will happen? And naturally, most of you guys are going to think, well, the number of white peppered moths should rebound. So what we see here is that in 1850, the Industrial Revolution started, and the number of dark moths shoots up, and the number of light moths plummets down. And we see that this trend stays the same until about 1980. And then in 1980, some regulations kicked in about, polluting the environment and stuff like that. And those trees were no longer covered with this sort of black soot. So, what happened then? The trees were white again. So, what do you expect? Well, what happens here is that the population of black moths starts to plummet because now they stick out like a sore thumb, and the number of white moths goes up because they now blend in with their environment. So, that's natural selection for you. Hopefully, I've given you enough to really kind of grasp the idea. It's not a difficult idea, but it is one that is central to understanding biology. So, here is your project for the week. It's sort of a final project, and it involves you making yet another Flipgrid and explaining your reasoning and things like that. So, what you're going to do is you are going to make a Flipgrid that covers both task 1 and task 2. So task 1's pretty straightforward. What we're doing here is we're giving you the gene for normal hemoglobin. Remember, hemoglobin is the gene or the protein that carries oxygen in your blood. And then we also give you the DNA for the mutated the mutated hemoglobin sickle cell gene. So this is the gene that gives you sickle cell. This is the normal gene. And you need to transcribe it into RNA and then translate it using a codon chart into the amino acid sequence. And then you'll show this on the Flipgrid and you'll answer these 3 questions. What kind of mutation is it? A deletion, insertion, or substitution? Is it a point mutation or a frame shift? And then is it a silent, missense, or nonsense mutation? All right, that's part 1. The second part is you are going to look at the data that we provide you, and you're going to use that to answer this guiding question. The guiding question is, why are there higher frequencies of the sickle cell gene in Central Africa compared to the rest of the globe? So let's look at this background and data that I provide you. So what I do is I give you a little bit of background information about mutations and natural selection. I talk a little bit about sickle cell anemia and what causes it, and then also about malaria. And so the puzzle here is we would expect natural selection to weed out the gene for sickle cell out of the human population because it is harmful. It prevents people from reproducing because it kills them before they can reproduce. Now, the question is, though, why are there such high levels of the sickle cell gene in Central Africa? Everywhere else in the world, the levels are very low. Why is it so high in Central Africa? And so here, I give you different pieces of data. Like this is the rates of sickle cell anemia across the globe. And this is the rates of malaria across the globe. And then there's a couple of graphs here for from these experiments. So you're going to use these pieces of data to come up with a claim as to what you think is making the rates of sickle cell anemia higher in Central Africa. And then you're going to provide evidence. And when you provide evidence, I want you to reference the data. Tell me what figure 1 says or what figure 2 said or something like that, right? What data do you think is important here? And then in your reasoning section, you are going to use the data and the background information to answer the guiding question. Your reasoning should explain how natural selection works generally and what it is doing with the specific situation here. And then there's also some questions for you to think about in your reasoning section as well. We have a few resources for you. So in a second, I'm going to post an example Flipgrid that you can watch to see what I want. Here's a link to, if you are one of my students, you will turn it in here. If you are one of Mrs. Cook's students, you'll turn it in here. And then this video is kind of a good overview of the ideas that we're talking about here. So you can click on this if you want extra information or a little bit of help with this idea of natural selection and the sickle cell trait. What's up, you guys? This is an example Flipgrid for you to kind of base your Flipgrid off of for this final project. So for part 1, let me get things figured out down here. So for part 1, you're supposed to take a normal gene and a mutant gene. Now, this is not the gene that you were assigned, okay? This is just a random gene, okay? But here what I did is I took the DNA from the normal gene and the mutant gene, I transcribed it into RNA, and then translated that into protein. And the mutation here that happened was an insertion. It added a base, which is a G, and that pushed everything else down. So that is a frame shift, and it resulted in 2 missense mutations and 1 silent mutation because it stayed lysine, but then arginine changed to threonine, and proline changed to threonine. For part 2, I'm not going to give you an actual example. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of run down what I am wanting to see in your claim, evidence, and reasoning. So remember, the guiding question is, why is sickle cell rates so high in Central Africa? So your claim would be the answer to that question, and you need to back up your claim with the data that I provide you, with evidence. You need to reference the data. You need to say things like figure 2 showed this, or figure 1 showed this. And then your reasoning needs to be your attempt at answering this question, but you need to use the data that's provided and also the background information. And your answer should also include what natural selection is doing. Your answer should be in terms of natural selection. What is natural selection favoring in this situation? How does natural selection work in general? Remember, there's also additional questions for you to tackle or to think about in that reasoning section.